After the Tower of Babel fell and humanity scattered across the earth, something dark settled over the world. Idolatry spread like wildfire. Nation after nation, family after family, they all turned away from the one true God. The Lord looked down and saw a hardened generation, their hearts carved into the image of false gods. And so he made a choice, to let them go their own way, to follow their evil paths. But not all of them. God always preserves a remnant. From Adam to Seth, from Enoch to Methuselah, from Noah to Shem, there had always been a line of faithful keepers, passing down the knowledge of God like a torch in the darkness. And now, that torch was about to be handed to a man named Abraham. Abraham grew up in Ur of the Chaldees, a city drenched in superstition and pagan worship. Everywhere he looked, there were altars to false gods, rituals to appease demons, and prayers sent up to blocks of wood and stone. Even his own father's house, the very family that had once preserved the knowledge of God, was beginning to slip. They served other gods now. The seductive influences of the culture around them were too strong, too familiar, too comfortable. But Abraham was different, faithful among the faithless, uncorrupted by the prevailing apostasy. While idolatry invited him on every side, he steadfastly clung to the worship of the one true God. Why? Because, as the psalmist would later write, the Lord is nigh unto all them that call upon him, to all that call upon him in truth. And God drew near to Abraham. He communicated his will to this faithful man. He gave him distinct knowledge of his law and, most incredibly, revealed to him the salvation that would one day come through Christ. Then came the promise that would echo through all human history. God said to Abraham, "I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." A great nation, a great name, a great blessing. But there was more, something even more precious. God told Abraham, "In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." This wasn't just about Abraham. This was about the Redeemer, the Messiah, the one who would come from his line to save the world. But before any of this could happen, there had to be a test, a sacrifice, a moment when Abraham would have to choose between everything he knew and a God he couldn't see. Then the message came, clear, direct, unmistakable. "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Leave your country, leave your relatives, leave your father's house. Go to a land I will show you, but I won't tell you where yet. Why would God ask this? Because to qualify Abraham for his great work as keeper of the sacred oracles, he had to be separated from the associations of his early life. The influence of kindred and friends would interfere with the training God had planned for his servant. Abraham was now connected with heaven in a special sense, and he needed to dwell among strangers. His character had to be peculiar, different from all the world. And here's the hardest part. He couldn't even explain his actions in a way his friends would understand. Spiritual things are spiritually discerned. His motives, his choices, his obedience, none of it made sense to his idolatrous relatives. Can you imagine that loneliness? Being called to something so great that the people you love most can't understand why you're doing it. The book of Hebrews tells us, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. Not knowing where he was going. Let that sink in for a moment. He packed up his entire life, said goodbye to everything familiar, and walked into the unknown because God said so. Abraham's unquestioning obedience stands as one of the striking evidences of faith in all of Scripture. To him, faith was the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. He relied on the divine promise without the least outward assurance of its fulfillment. He abandoned home, kindred, and native land, and went forth not knowing where, simply following where God would lead. Later, the same passage says, "By faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise, as in a land not his own, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise." This was no light test, no small sacrifice. There were strong ties binding him to his country, his family, his home. Emotional ties, cultural ties, financial ties. But Abraham didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions about the land of promise. He didn't wonder if the soil was fertile, if the climate was healthy, if the country would give him opportunities for wealth. God had spoken, and for Abraham, that was enough. The happiest place on earth for him was the place where God wanted him to be. Many are still tested as Abraham was. You might not hear God's voice speaking directly from the heavens, but he calls through the teachings of his word and the events of his providence. You may be required to abandon a career that promises wealth and honor, to leave congenial and profitable associations, to separate from kindred, to enter what looks like nothing but self-denial, hardship, and sacrifice. Why? Because God has a work for you to do. And sometimes a life of ease and the influence of friends and family would hinder the development of the very traits essential for that work. He calls you away from human influences and aid. He leads you to feel the need of His help, to depend on Him alone, so that He may reveal Himself to you. Here's the question. Who is ready at the call of providence to renounce cherished plans and familiar associations? Who will accept new duties and enter untried fields, doing God's work with a firm and willing heart? Who will count their losses as gain for Christ's sake? Whoever does this has the faith of Abraham and will share with him that far more exceeding and eternal glory with which the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared. The call from heaven first came to Abraham when he lived in Ur of the Chaldees. In obedience to it, he moved to Haran. His father's family came with him, for they mixed their idolatry with the worship of the true God. Abraham stayed in Haran until his father Terah died, but from his father's grave the divine voice told him to go forward. His brother Nahor and his household chose to stay. They clung to their home and their idols. Besides Sarah, Abraham's wife, only Lot, the son of Abraham's brother Haran, long since dead, chose to share the pilgrim life. Still, it was a large company that left Mesopotamia. Abraham already had extensive flocks and herds, the riches of the East, and he was surrounded by a numerous body of servants and workers. He was leaving the land of his fathers, never to return, and he took everything he had, their possessions, their livestock, and the souls they had won in Haran. Among those who traveled with him were many led by higher considerations than service and self-interest. During their time in Haran, both Abraham and Sarah had led others to worship and serve the true God. These people attached themselves to the patriarch's household and went with him to the land of promise. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. The first place they stopped was Shechem, under the shade of the oaks of Moreh in a wide grassy valley, with olive groves and gushing springs between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim.
Abraham set up camp. It was a fair and beautiful country, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. But for the worshipper of Jehovah, a heavy shadow rested on every wooded hill and fruitful plain. The Canaanite was in the land. Abraham had reached the goal of his hopes only to find it occupied by an alien race and covered with idolatry. In the groves stood altars to false gods. Human sacrifices were offered on the nearby heights. Can you imagine the disappointment, the confusion? He had left everything behind for this, and now the promised land
was filled with darkness. While he clung to the divine promise, it was not without distressing fears that he pitched his tent. And then God appeared. The Lord appeared unto Abram and said, "Unto thy seed will I give this land." Right when Abraham needed it most, God showed up. His faith was strengthened by this assurance that the divine presence was with him. He wasn't left to the mercy of the wicked. So he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. Still a traveler, he soon moved to a spot near Bethel, erected another altar, and called on the name of the Lord. Abraham, the friend of God, set a worthy example for all who would follow. His was a life of prayer. Wherever he pitched his tent, close beside it stood his altar, calling all within his camp to morning and evening sacrifice. When his tent was moved, the altar remained. In the years that followed, roving Canaanites who had received instruction from Abraham would come upon these altars, and they would know who had been there before them. When they pitched their tents, they would repair the altar and worship the living God. One man's faithfulness became a lighthouse for others wandering in darkness. Abraham continued traveling southward, and once again his faith was tested. The heavens withheld their rain, the brooks stopped flowing in the valleys, the grass withered on the plains. The flocks and herds found no pasture. Starvation threatened the entire camp. Did Abraham question the leadings of providence now? Did he look back with longing to the plenty of the Chaldean plains? Everyone was watching to see what Abraham would do as trouble after trouble piled upon him. As long as his confidence appeared unshaken, they felt hope. They were assured that God was his friend and still guiding him. Abraham couldn't explain God's ways. He hadn't realized his expectations, but he held fast to the promise, "I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." With earnest prayer, he considered how to preserve the lives of his people and flocks, but he would not allow circumstances to shake his faith in God's word. To escape the famine, he went down to Egypt. Notice, he didn't forsake Canaan. He didn't turn back to the Chaldean land where there was bread. He sought temporary refuge as close as possible to the land of promise, planning to return shortly. The Lord in his providence brought this trial upon Abraham to teach him lessons of submission, patience, and faith, lessons that would be recorded for all who would later endure affliction. God leads his children by a way they don't know, but he never forgets or abandons those who trust in him. He allowed affliction to come upon Job, but he didn't forsake him. He permitted beloved John to be exiled to lonely Patmos, but his watch was filled with scenes of immortal glory. God permits trials to assault his people, so that through their constancy and obedience they may be spiritually enriched, and their example may strengthen others. As he says in Jeremiah, "I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil." The very trials that test our faith most severely and make it seem God has abandoned us, these are meant to lead us closer to Christ, that we may lay all our burdens at his feet and experience the peace he gives in exchange.
God has always tested his people in the furnace of affliction. It's in the heat of the furnace that the dross is separated from the true gold of Christian character. Jesus watches the test. He knows what's needed to purify the precious metal so it may reflect the radiance of his love. It's through close testing trials that God disciplines his servants. He sees that some have powers that can advance his work, and he puts them through trials. In his providence, he brings them into positions that test their character and reveal defects and weaknesses hidden even to themselves. He gives them opportunity to correct these flaws and fit themselves for his service. He shows them their weakness and teaches them to lean on him, for he is their only help and safeguard. When God calls them to action, they're ready, and heavenly angels can unite with them in the work to be done on earth. During his stay in Egypt, Abraham proved that he wasn't free from human weakness and imperfection. In concealing the fact that Sarah was his wife, he betrayed a distrust of divine care. He lacked the lofty faith and courage he had shown so often and so nobly. Sarah was beautiful, and Abraham had no doubt the Egyptians would desire her and would not hesitate to kill him to take her. He reasoned that he wasn't lying by calling Sarah his sister. She was his father's daughter, though not his mother's. But this concealment of their real relationship was deception. No deviation from strict integrity can meet God's approval. Through Abraham's lack of faith, Sarah was placed in great danger. The king of Egypt, informed of her beauty, had her taken to his palace, intending to make her his wife. But the Lord, in his great mercy, protected Sarah by sending judgments on the royal household. This is how the king learned the truth. Indignant at being deceived, he confronted Abraham. "What is this that thou hast done to me? Why saidst thou, she is my sister, so I might have taken her to me to wife? Now therefore behold thy wife, take her and go thy way." Even though Abraham had been greatly favored by Pharaoh, the king ordered him to leave Egypt. Pharaoh would not permit harm to come to Abraham or his company. He even provided a guard to escort them safely out. But Abraham had to go. Pharaoh had nearly committed a serious sin because of Abraham's deception, but God had stopped him. The king saw in this stranger a man whom the God of heaven honored. He feared having someone in his kingdom who was so clearly under divine favor. If Abraham stayed, his increasing wealth and honor might excite envy, and injury might come to him, bringing more judgments on Egypt. The warning given to Pharaoh became a protection for Abraham in all his future dealings with pagan peoples. The story couldn't be kept secret. It became known that the God Abraham worshipped would protect his servant, and any injury done to him would be avenged. It's a dangerous thing to wrong one of the children of the King of Heaven. The psalmist refers to this when speaking of God's chosen people. He reproved kings for their sakes, saying, "Touch not mine anointed, and do my prophets no harm." There's an interesting parallel between Abraham's experience in Egypt and that of his descendants centuries later. Both went to Egypt because of famine. Both stayed there for a time. Through divine judgments shown on their behalf, the fear of them fell upon the Egyptians, and both left Egypt enriched by the gifts of the pagans, departing with great wealth. Abraham's story is your story. His call is your call. His struggles are your struggles. His God is your God. He left everything familiar because he heard a voice he couldn't ignore. He walked into the unknown because he trusted the one who knew the way. He failed sometimes because he was human, but he got back up because God was faithful. He built altars in a land of idols because worship was his anchor. And through it all, God was preparing him, refining him, teaching him, making him into the father of faith whose legacy would stretch across every generation. What is God calling you to leave behind today?
What familiar shore is he asking you to step away from? What promised land is he inviting you towards, even though you can't see it yet? Remember Abraham. Remember that faith is the absence of fear or doubt. Faith is obedience in the presence of both. Faith is saying yes when you don't have all the answers. Faith is building an altar when the land still belongs to pagans. Faith is holding on to the promise when circumstances scream otherwise. If you've been encouraged by Abraham's journey, I invite you to subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the lives of these remarkable men and women of faith. Share this with someone who needs to hear that God is still in the business of calling ordinary people to extraordinary faith. And come back next time because Abraham's story isn't over, not by a long shot. We haven't even gotten to Isaac yet. We haven't talked about the test that would define Abraham's entire life. We haven't seen the moment when God would ask for the ultimate sacrifice and Abraham would lift the knife over his own son. That's next time. Until then, may you walk by faith and not by sight. May you trust the promise even when you can't see the path. And may you, like Abraham, become a blessing to all the families of the earth. This is the story of Abraham. This is the call that changed everything. This is what it means to be the friend of God.